And risk management is something that most businesses, especially the small businesses in our landscape, don't really think too much about. The common misconception is that risk is an enterprise level concept and is dealt with when you think of big enterprise level businesses, large businesses. But the reality is, risk management is not an enterprise function, it is a business function. At the end of the day, especially around IT, which is where we're going to focus today, risk really presents a couple of pieces that you probably want to be aware of. And at its highest level, when we define risk, it's when a threat exists that can exploit a weakness in any type of assets that you value in your business. And as we dive into this today, there are really 5 elements, key elements, when we talk about risk management that we believe you as a small or medium-sized business owner should be aware of. And so the first of those elements is about communication. And at the highest level, when we talk about risk communication, and again, we're looking at this through the lens of IT, it's how does your leadership communicate its appetite and decisions when you're looking at IT risk to an organization. So Marc, as your role in our organization as really a strategic advisor, what are some common themes that you see when it comes to communicating risk in a business? And you can talk about best case, worst case, what you've seen so far.
Sure. Well, the communicating around this concept first involves understanding, right? And that's when a leadership team, and again, the leadership team might be one person, it might be 4 people. It just kind of depends on the structure of the business. But the question that really, when you start with risk management, the idea is, what are we comfortable with? Like, everybody, every individual, and then of course every business has its own personality around risk. Some are more tolerant than others as a sort of a default position. They're more aggressive or conservative. And it's really trying to iron out that mix of things first, is to say, hey, how do we come to some agreement that can be communicated to everybody else? Because at the end of the day, risk management is really about setting a tone for decision making within the organization, right? And so, a lot of times for small businesses, those things aren't defined, or they're defined in the moment, or they're situational. And what that ends up resulting in is the leader has to be involved in every single decision. And that might work for, some businesses. That might be by design in some businesses, but it will always put a cap on the size or the success of your organization. You just have to make sure that's right sized for you. So when we talk about that communication and decision piece, part of it's about the profile itself, but then it's also when those individual decisions do come up that are more appropriate just for the leadership team to handle. What's that process going through, and how does that get pushed out to the rest of the organization so that they can adhere to that risk level? That's how you get consistent levels of risk throughout the organization.
It's really unique because and you said this, every organization is different, right? You talk about a 6-person organization, you probably have one person at the top that's really looking at a lot of these decisions. But in order to scale up your business, at some point, you've got to be able to delegate or appropriate responsibilities in certain organizations and making certain business units responsible for the risk in whatever area that they operate in. And tying into that really is the second key element when we talk about risk management, and that's the risk decision process. And so when we describe that, it's really how we identify, measure, and treat an IT risk to the organization. So, Marc, maybe you could share a little bit about what we've seen, how we approach this, or how we suggest companies approach this process for, again, identifying, measuring, and treating an IT risk to your organization.
It's going to be, a little bit unique for every business, but there are some common themes that happen there. Some identifiable uh, linchpins, I guess you'd say, to that. And I think the most common thing that's always missing around this is just the structure of it, right? Is to have a process that everybody's able to prepare for, so that it's not just talking about something when it comes up in the moment, and then also that it's got a little bit of foresight to it. Obviously, you can't predict everything, but the worst time to be addressing or deciding a risk is when it just got realized. Right.
Mhm.
At that point, it's become an event and you are scrambling. So you want to be able to talk about potential risks before they happen. You want to be able to identify what the impact is beyond that, but you also want to get multiple perspectives on that, because it's going to look a little different to the CEO than it might to the CFO, or it might look a little different to someone who's responsible for the operations versus somebody who's responsible for the security. So your process needs to have multiple perspectives, have a little bit of foresight to it, but then it also the frequency of it's going to matter, but that's what's going to be unique. But it's got to be defined as you go along with that, So, and you've got to be disciplined to it. So if you decide that you need to review risks every 90 days, make sure you do it every 90 days. If it's every 30, do it then. That's going to be about how dynamic is your business. It could be earlier in maturation stages, so that a lot of those things are coming up often. It could be fairly stable. It might be in an industry that moves quickly. So again, take those things into consideration as you build out this process and set some parameters for it. But the important part as well is to make sure that there's a decision being made. At the end of the day, the default for any risk is that you're accepting it, because doing nothing is accepting the risk. Not identifying it is accepting the risk. And that's really what this process is about as a whole. When you look at it, is making sure that you're taking the right risks. So once you have identified a business risk and can kind of figure out how that fits in with your IT component, it's talking about how do we maybe mitigate that is one option, or it could be to transfer it or avoid it. As an example, a lot of the things that come up around security for IT are these big considerations around ransomware and impacting the business. And so for most, the risk of an attack of that nature is incredibly high. The question is, how that level of impact, where would that fit in terms of your organization's ability to survive it or to absorb it? And again, that gap between risk threshold and risk impact is usually one that requires some kind of treatment. And one of the common options for that is, to transfer some of that risk in terms of a cybersecurity insurance policy, right?
Mhm.
You're no longer taking on the full brunt of that event happening. Maybe that's appropriate for your environment, maybe it's not. Again, that's the kind of thing that you're fleshing out in this process, so that the business has considered all of its considerations and has made a single decision moving forward.
So I really like the fact that you highlighted the point that you have to have multiple perspectives in here, because you don't know what you don't know. And those are the things, you don't know what you don't know. Those are the things that are the gotchas and the ahas
Right.
if you don't have enough perspectives in there. And in addition to doing that, that drives us to the third point, or key element of this process, which is around documentation. So once you identify this process of understanding the risk, measuring it, putting some mitigations, or determining how you're going to address it, it's about documenting it. And again, this is where the power really comes to risk management, because you're putting it on paper and you're maturing it, and it's something that you now have documented, sometimes in a single point in time, and you can see it. So give me some points here, Mark, of when you work with clients who have a risk decision process, what does that documentation look like typically that you see in organizations?
Well, To your point, documentation, this is pretty straightforward. I mean, this is no different than any other business function or business activity, right? I mean, if you document it, you've got some history to it. You can see it progress. You can see the trends. You can go back and understand why certain decisions were made at a certain point in time for the business. And sometimes it's, again, when you talk about something that's happening every 90 days, it's just hard to remember what was happening, 90 days ago with all the things that happen in a business. And so, the final end game for this is really a risk register, as you mentioned earlier, right? It's the idea of being able to track the existing register, or excuse me, the existing risk within the business that have been identified, and some idea of where they fall with regard to the process of treating them. Whether they've been accepted, or there's a plan to put something in place, or something has been put in place. That the risk has been treated and it's below the residual risk level that the business has chosen as a threshold. And really just being able to see that in a snapshot and talk about that on a routine basis. And, coming into that, some feeder for that is really the idea of having, again, these concepts defined for the business that are also documented and agreed upon. Having a scale. What is, how do we as an organization look at what's a low risk, what's a high risk, what's a medium risk? Maybe the idea of, talking about what our thresholds are. For us, not us, but in particular organization, maybe we're willing to accept risks up to $100,000. That's the dollar amount that we're comfortable with, that we can pay out over time. If that's the case, where does a high live? Where does a medium live? Where does a low live? So then again, it just establishes a common language for that discussion that's happening on the risk register. So it's pretty straightforward stuff for the documentation.
And I would almost argue, going back to the first two elements we just talked about, it becomes extremely challenging. I would say nearly impossible for you to be a great risk communicator as a leader in your organization without this type of artifact in place, because this is a documented point that actually shows your organization in some way, shape, or form where you were, the progress you've made. It's a communication mechanism. And if you don't have a risk register, you don't have a matrix, you don't have something that shows your threshold or acceptable level of risk, I don't see how you can communicate. You might verbalize it, but again, there's nothing tangible for someone to go back and even said it. Time passes after 90 days. Right. If you just try to go by from memory, good luck, man. I think documentation is such a crucial point, and it's often the one that gets missed the most. But it also is the connector to the fourth key element, which is, again, this is where I think what we do at D3 is a real differentiator to business. It's translating IT risk to business risk, taking those technical pieces and understanding how does it impact your business. So looking at your technical systems that help run your company, and how does it map to the results your business is in trying to do. And again, I think this is one of those things, Mark, where I know you have a lot of expertise in this area, where there's a lot of light bulb moments that go on. When we present this concept, we have a lot of customers that just you can see them finally get it. And I think this is a missing piece in the IT world overall. But I'll ask you, what have you seen when you've presented this element to businesses in general?
The default state for pretty much every business is that business risk and technical risk, or IT risk, they're separate. They are two different concepts, and they are not related really at all. But to make good decisions on your IT risk, you have to understand what the impact of the business is, because as we talked about previously, it's all about the value. And the common expression of value within a business is dollars. What's the impact of, the easiest example for most to follow along with is sort of this, aging or underspec hardware. I've got a laptop that is no longer doing the job. do I need to replace that, or what risk does it present to my organization? Because risk is not just, hey, there was a security breach. Risk is also, hey, I can't do my job, right? Whatever my role is to the organization that helps the organization generate value and productivity, I'm relying on my tools, otherwise known as my technology.
Mm-hmm.
And if my technology is either A, unavailable, or B, can't keep up with what I'm doing, then it is creating a negative, it's a headwind, right, on me as a producer. So if there's a laptop that costs a couple of $1,000s to replace, and that's a laptop that the main producer in your organization who generates $50,000 a month of revenue, if they're impacted by that, there's your treatment to the risk, right? The risk is you can't generate the full $50,000 of revenue. It's going to cost you $2,000 to mitigate that risk. How much of a drop off are you having because of your situation, because of that status quo? If the answer is that it's not much drop off, then you probably aren't going to spend the money. If the answer is, hey, we've lost 20% of our revenue per month, then yes, it's easy to make that decision of 2,000. So you try to make clear analysis of what is this risk impacting the business. That same laptop is a kiosk in your lobby that is available for public use for whatever reason, to maybe explore your catalog or something of that nature. How much risk does it have on your business? It's really there more of as a courtesy item or a sales enabler that you have workarounds for, or you have other channels for. So you're probably not going to you're probably not going to replace that $2,000 in a laptop because it's not having $2,000 worth of risk to your business. So that's, sort of the structure of that conversation. And it's very difficult to have if the person who's identifying the IT risk and the person who's identifying the business risk don't have some appreciation of the perspective on the other side. And that's how you translate that. And that is the missing piece for all of this. Even though we're talking about this a little bit later in the conversation, it's because the business has to go through some maturation to be able to get to have a productive conversation in translating that risk. I always tell our clients it's much easier for me to learn your business than it is for you to learn IT, right? And so that's part of the journey, is helping to understand what the business looks like and understand how technology plugs into it and enables it.
As we were talking about this, when I was in the military, we used to follow this concept called the military decision-making process. And what was very unique about it is it's
very
really
original naming, by the way.
Very original name, right? MDMP, man. But essentially, it goes back to, we had different organizations of a battalion that focused on a certain business function of the unit and its ability to execute and succeed in a mission. And so my focus was in the communication side. And I could specifically remember we were at a field training exercise, and I remember looking at the map, looking at topography, and understanding, I needed my battalion commander to be able to talk to all of his company commanders to operate and execute the mission. And I'll never forget that this is the night before a big operation, and we were finalizing pieces. And I know that there was a huge gap in our area of operation, and the only way to talk on the radio between the gap is to put what we call retrans. It's a retransmission asset that basically it's act as like a repeater of the radio frequency over his area operation. There was a huge dead spot, and the brigade had offered this aerial retrans UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle. I had never heard of it before. It was new technology, and I told my battalion commander, I said, "Sir, I don't trust it. Here's what I need. They see this mountain. I need to put one of my vehicles here, and I need protection for that." And he argued with me about it for a while, but I stuck firm, and he's like, "Captain Almeida, I don't know why I'm going to do this," but he looked at one of his commanders and said, get him a tank to protect that vehicle. So next day we went on the operation. As soon as the brigade launched the aerial bird, it crashed. So guess what happened? Every other battalion that trusted that asset for communication lost all their comms except for one battalion. You know which battalion it was? It was mine. And after the mission was over, my battalion commander comes in. He says, "Sicko." That was usually that's how they call it. So it was like a kind of a funny derogatory term. When I say, "What's up, sir?" He goes, "Mike, I just want to tell you something. I know I was pretty hard on you yesterday, but I just want to tell you thank you, because if it wasn't for you pushing back on me, we wouldn't have been able to talk on the battlefield today. We were the only people who had comps." But I share that story because, Mark, I think what I was able to do without realizing it, and this happened 14 years ago, but I look at it now, is I was able to take the technical risk and say, "Sir, understand that I don't know the functionality of this. I don't trust it, but I do know that if you want to be able to talk and communicate on the battlefield and execute on this mission, here is what you'll need to do. And if you don't have this and you don't protect it, your ultimate mission is at jeopardy. Your ability to communicate and operate in the battlefield it's at a high level of risk that I don't think you'd be willing to accept." And he obliged to it. And so as a result of me tying that technical risk to the business results of succeeding in the mission, he took the advice, and we were the only battalion in the brigade that was actually able to do that. So I think it's a funny story because it's now I can see it years later of how it takes that concept that we're talking about here and really ties it to this last key element, which is your residual risk level. So what we mean by that is the level of IT risk remaining in your organization after you take those results and apply it. So again, if I go back to this quick story, what I did is saying, yep, there's a gap here. So there's a huge gap of being able to communicate. But if I take this piece of technology and I place it in this area, it removes that gap. And so the risk element of you not being able to talk on the battlefield is substantially reduced, and the probability that you're going to be able to talk effectively is there. But now going back, taking away from military and going into small and medium businesses, Mark, tell us the importance of why businesses should understand residual risk and should be willing to take controls and apply it to that risk in their business.
Well, translating your story a little bit, take it from, again, to the military aspect to just deploying a new technology, period. Businesses do that all the time. Introducing a new technology always introduces an element of risk. You mitigate that risk by testing, right? You guys have not had a chance to do that, so you were of the opinion that, hey, this is too high of a risk to be able to introduce into our production environment, or to how we're getting excuse me, how we're getting the job done. And that's a scenario that comes up a lot for businesses every day, is how do we, you have your status quo and you want to progress in the business, and you feel like, hey, we need a new technology to do that. So you've got some risk to selecting a new technology, buying a new, paying for it, and then implementing it into your environment, training your people, all of those are a risk component that you have to consider when you're making the decision around change. But just this idea of residual, risk in terms of how it impacts, the businesses as you go along here, the goal is to keep whatever risk threshold you've defined. Again, we're at a place where we are comfortable living with $50,000 as a risk threshold. Are your risks that you currently have, are they valued at that level or lower? If you've got a yes to all of that, then you're doing a really great job of your risk management, and you're in a place where any unexpected happenings, you're going to be able to manage them, and you're going to be able to manage them well. You don't get there by default or happenstance. That's a result of very targeted and actively managed risk management process, what we're talking about here. And so the key for any business, and the whole point of this entire component, when we talk about it's a requirement for effective IT, is being able to answer the question, are we taking the right IT risks? Everybody's got to take some level of risk, because that's how that's how you generate value. But is it the right ones? Do we know which risks they are? And do we know at what level they potentially can impact our business? And that residual risk needs to be under that level. That's what you're trying to accomplish.
Well said. So I think in summary, as we wrap up here, the 5 key takeaways we want you to have, again, are when we look at risk management, here are the 5 key elements. Again, I'm going to run through so you understand it. Risk communication. How do you communicate your appetite, your decisions when you look at IT risk for your team or your business? Number 2, the risk decision process. How do you identify, measure, and treat the IT risk in your organization? Number 3, how do you document that risk approach, your risk decision process? What type of mechanism are you using to memorialize that? Number 4, translating IT risk to business decision risk. How do you take the risk of your technical systems and how do you apply it to your business results that you want to achieve? And number 5 is your residual risk. After you take the IT risk and you provide controls to mitigate that, what does that look like at the end of the day to your organization, and making sure you understand it? So if you take these 5 elements and you really apply them to your business, I promise you that you will transform the way that your business operates through the lens of technology. You'll be more focused, you'll be more diligent, and you'll have a better sense of understanding how technology can truly impact your business from any perspective in your organization. Marc, final thoughts on risk management for small and medium-sized businesses?
Only that it's a journey. It's not a destination. The 5 things we've mentioned today, everybody has them at some level today in their organization, even if that level is, say a 1 on a scale of 1 to 5. And you don't get from a 1 to a 3 to a 5 overnight. It's a process, and it will always continue to evolve. To evolve. And the only real advice I would say is start and see how it goes from there. You get better by doing.
Better by doing. That's the best way to say it.